Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois Facebook page and story time. The story we have today comes from Europe, and this is a story about a young boy who, although he was rather small, was quite smart and was able to use his small size to great advantage. This is the story of Tom Thumb. Once long ago, there was a family. The father was a woodcutter, and the mother stayed at home and took care of the children, and there were 7 of them. Now, the youngest child, he was a very different child. His name was Tom, and when he was born, he was not much bigger than his father's thumb. And so his family sometimes called him Tom Thumb just because he had been so small. And he kept hoping that when he grew up and became a teenager and a grown-up man, that he would get taller. And he did, but he never quite caught up to his brothers. And so his family still sometimes called him Tom Thumb, even though he was quite grown up almost when this story happens. Well, one year, it was just not a good year. And the harvest hadn't been very good. And food was very expensive. And the woodcutter, the father, the family, he was having a very hard time making enough money to feed his family. And finally, one day, he went to his wife when the boys were all in bed, and he said, "Wife, we have a problem." He said, I cannot even earn enough money for a loaf of bread. And I don't know about you, dear, but I cannot bear to watch the boys starve. Tom doesn't eat very much. She's so small, but his brothers all eat quite a lot, and I can't even afford to get a loaf of bread to feed them with. I don't know what to do. And the woodcutter and his wife thought about it for a while, and finally the woodcutter said, "I know what we have to do. I know what we have to do." In all of the stories, whenever someone gets adopted by a rich person, a rich merchant or a prince or something like that, they're always lost in the woods. So perhaps if we take the boys into the woods and leave them there, they will be rescued by a rich merchant or a prince or, I don't know, someone who will have enough money to feed them. Well, his wife was not happy with this idea. She would miss her boys so very much. But they didn't have any money to feed them. And so while the mother and father, the woodcutter and his wife, argued for a bit about it, in the end they decided that it was probably the wisest thing to do. Now, what they didn't know is that Tom, that particular night, had gotten tired before everyone else, and he'd actually fallen asleep under a chair in the dining room. And so he woke up when his mother and father started arguing and talking about this whole problem, and his mother was crying, and it was kind of noisy. So he woke up, and he heard what his father said, and he didn't want to get left in the forest. Oh, no. No. He really didn't think hoping that a rich merchant or a prince would rescue them from the forest was a very wise idea. So, the next morning, when Tom woke up, he went out into the garden and he gathered a whole bunch of the little white pebbles that lay all scattered throughout their garden, and he stuffed his pockets with them. And he put them in a little bag that he carried with him everywhere he went. And a couple of days later, their mother said to the boys, "Boys, your father's going to take you into the forest with him today. You can play games and have all the fun you should enjoy. You'll have so much fun." But her eyes were red and she looked rather sad. And Tom knew they were going to be left in the forest that day. And his brothers asked their mother why she looked so sad. And she said, "Oh, I've just been thinking about something sad. Don't worry about it. Boys, go with your father, have some fun." And so they did. Well, as they walked along the road, Tom very quietly reached into his pocket and dropped a pebble. And after a little while longer, he dropped another pebble. And soon they were deep in the forest. And their father said, and the boys were getting a little tired because they'd been walking for quite some time. And their father said, well, boys, here's some sticks gathered about. Gather the sticks together and make yourself a little fire, and I'll go off into the forest and find some more wood for the fire. And we could just take a little rest here, and then we'll go home later. Well, the boys sat down and they made a fire. They started the fire, and it started burning, and they rested for a little while, and then they started playing some games, and then it started to get dark. And the forest started to get a little bit scary because there was noises and rustling in the underbrush and in the trees and sounds that sounded like hoo, hoo, hoo. You know, they thought they were owls, but maybe not. They might be ghosts. Who knew? They weren't really sure. And so his brothers were getting rather scared, and they were starting to wonder where Father had gone. Had he gotten lost in the forest? Would he ever come back again? Would they ever see him again? And some of his brothers started to cry, the younger ones. But Tom said, don't cry. It's all right. I'm sure Father just couldn't come back to find us. He got closer to home, and he went home, and he thought we would be there. It's not a big deal, brothers. Just lie down and take a rest, and in the morning we'll find our way back home again. Don't you worry. And I'm sure Father will be waiting there to greet us when we get there. And so his brothers were calmed a little bit because they all knew Tom was quite a clever boy. And so they all lay down, and they slept through the night, and in the morning, Tom showed them where he had dropped the little pebbles along the path, and they followed the pebbles back home. Well, that was all very well and good, and Father and Mother were very happy to see them again, but they still didn't have any food in the house. So a couple of days later, Father tried his plan again. This time, he took the boys far deeper into the forest, to a much darker part of the forest, and this time, Tom had no warning. So he couldn't gather pebbles to mark their way home. But as he was going out of the house, he snatched up a piece of bread that was lying there on the table, and he crumbled it up in his hands, and as he went, he dropped little breadcrumbs along the road. But the problem is, it had been a rather hard year, not just for the humans, but also for the animals, and the birds were very hungry. And so they saw those breadcrumbs, and they thought those looked tasty. And so they flew down as soon as Tom and his family were gone, and they ate up all the breadcrumbs. So when they got deep in the forest, Father had them build a fire again, and he went off to find more firewood. And he left them there. And Tom's brothers started to get scared again when it got dark, and Tom said, don't worry about it. Lie down, and in the morning we'll find our way home. It'll be all right. You'll see. But when they got up in the morning, they couldn't find their way home. They looked everywhere. There were no breadcrumbs. And they figured out that the birds had probably eaten them. Well, some of Tom's little brothers began to cry. But eventually Tom said, you know what? Crying isn't going to do us any good. Let's get up and start walking. And I'm sure eventually we will find a way out of the forest. Or if we don't find a way out of the forest, maybe we'll find someone who can give us directions so we can get back home to Father's house. And so the boys started walking. And they walked for quite a while. And then it started to rain. Well, walking in the rain is lots of fun if you can go into a nice, warm, dry house at the end of it and get dried off and get some lunch or dinner and fill up your empty, hungry belly. But walking in the rain when there's no house and no supper at the other end of the walk is not very much fun. And Tom and his brothers were miserable. But after a little while, Tom said, I have an idea. See this tree right here? I'm going to climb up this tree, and I'm going to go as high up as I can. And because Tom was so small, he could go quite a bit higher in a climbing tree than most other people could. And so he climbed up the tree, and he looked out as far as he could see. It was just forest. But there's a light over there. And so he climbed down from the tree and he told his brothers, there's a light over there. And they said, is it Father's house? And he said, I don't think so, but it's a light. So if they don't have anything to give us for food, and we can ask, perhaps they can at least give us directions back to Father's house. And so the boys began trudging through the forest towards that light. Well, by the time they got there, they were all exhausted and soaked through to the skin. They didn't have any dry clothing on them anywhere. They were soaking wet. Well, they got there toward the light, and what they found was a very big house that actually looked a little bit more like a castle than a house to the boys who were used to their little woodcutter's hut. Well, they walked up to the front door, and Tom knocked on the door. And nothing happened. And then he knocked on the door again. And after a little while, a very tall, thin woman came to the door. And she took one look at the boys and she said, oh no, you should not be here. My husband is an ogre and he loves to eat little boys. He'll eat all of you. You shouldn't stay here. And Tom said, oh, but please, we're so hungry and we're lost and we're soaking wet. Please, can't we come in just for a few minutes? Couldn't we have a slice of bread or something? We're starving and we're lost and we're so wet. Please. And the woman said, well, I really shouldn't. You see, my husband likes little boy. It's his favorite meal. And I'm afraid if you come in, then you'll still be here when he gets here and he'll eat you. And I couldn't stand that. And Tom said, oh, but please. Finally, the woman decided, all right, fine, come inside, come into the kitchen, but you must be quiet, for my 7 daughters are sleeping upstairs, and they're almost as bad as their father. They've begun eating little boy for breakfast too now. And just be quiet, sit here by the fire, and I will bring you each a bowl of porridge. And so she brought them all a big bowl of hearty, warm porridge, and they ate their porridge up, and it was so delicious. It tasted wonderful. And their clothes started to dry out as they sat near the fire. And they started to laugh and giggle with each other a little bit and joke around a little. But they took care to be rather quiet as they did it, so that they wouldn't wake up the ogre's 7 daughters that were upstairs. But then, all of a sudden, just as Tom was beginning to think he and his brothers should probably be on their way, the ground began to shake. And there was a pounding at the door. And the ogre's wife said, oh no, my husband has come back. Quick, quick, get underneath that bench over there. There was a little bench there that had a cabinet underneath it so that it was all covered up. And so they quick skittered underneath that bench and hid under the bench, and they hoped that the ogre would not realize they were there. Well, the ogre came into the kitchen and he, fee-fo-fum, you smell your supper. It's nearly ready. Sit down, I'll bring it to you. And so the ogre's wife went to fetch his meal, his meat and his potatoes and all of his food that she had made for him. But while she was fetching the meal, the ogre was still smelling. He didn't think that smelled like mutton or beef or pork. That smelled like boy. And so he began to look around the kitchen. And as he looked around the kitchen, he started, no, that's not big enough. That's not big enough. There's not enough room there. I can see through that. He spotted that bench. And with a roar, he jumped up and he ran over and he turned over the bench. And there was Tom and his 6 brothers sitting underneath that bench trying to stay hidden. Well, the ogre was so excited. 7 tasty little boys, and he could eat them all himself. It was wonderful. But his wife had already made him dinner, and she managed to convince him that it would be better to have these little boys for breakfast. That would be the best plan. And so Tom and his brothers got a little bit of a short space before they were going to be killed and eaten. But that was still not a very good feeling, to know that in the morning you are going to be killed and eaten. That's just scary. Well, the ogre sat down to his dinner, and the ogre's wife said, I will take these boys upstairs and put them to bed, and in the morning you can have them for your breakfast. And so she took them upstairs, and she said, now you must be very, very quiet, for my 7 daughters are asleep in the other bed in this room, and you must sleep in this bed, and they are sleeping there, but do not wake them up, for they have sharp little teeth, and they will just eat you up. And so Tom and his 7 brothers quietly crawled into the other bed in the room, and one by one, his brothers all fell asleep. But Tom was thinking that the ogre might change his mind, and he might decide to come upstairs in the middle of the night and kill Tom and his brothers and eat them then. And he didn't want that to happen, so Tom was trying to think how he could keep that from happening. And then he remembered. Those 7 little ogresses had all had little golden crowns on their heads, and the ogre's wife had told him that the ogre liked his daughters to wear their little crowns even to bed, because he said they were his little princesses, even though they were quite ugly and very ogre-y. Well, Tom and all of his brothers, because they had been out in the woods, they had their little woolly caps on to keep their heads warm. And so Tom went over to the bed, and he took off his brothers' woolly caps, and he put them on all of the princesses' heads, the little ogresses' heads, and he took off their golden crowns, and he put them on his brothers' heads. And then he climbed back into the bed. And no sooner had he climbed back into bed and put the last little crown on his own head than he heard something very heavy coming up the stairs. Sure enough, the ogre had gotten impatient. He had decided that he wanted to have at least one of those little boys now, and he did not want them to get away in the middle of the night. And so he went upstairs with his sharpest knife, and he went up to the bed where he thought the little boys were sleeping, and he felt it was rather dark in the room, so he really couldn't see very well. Ogres can't see very well anyway, and he didn't want to light a candle and risk waking up the boys and have them try to escape, or worse, waking up his daughters and have them start screaming because he woke them up too early. So he walked up to the bed, and he put out his big ogre hand, and he felt on the bed right near the head, and he found a head, and this head had a crown on it. Wrong bed. This must be my daughter's, he thought, and he went over to the other bed, and he felt at the head, and sure enough, yep, woolly cap. And he took his sharp knife, and he killed all 7 of the little children lying in that bed. His 7 ogress daughters is who he killed. Well, by that time, the ogre was getting rather sleepy. You see, he had had quite a large meal and quite a lot of wine with his dinner. And so he decided he would go to bed, and in the morning his wife could boil the boys for his breakfast, and they would be delicious that way. They could roast them in the oven and boil up some of the innards, and it would be delicious. And he went to bed drooling and thinking about the wonderful breakfast he was going to have in the morning. Well, no sooner had the ogre gone downstairs and Tom heard him start to snore than he reached over and he woke up his brothers and he said, "We have to leave now. The ogre thinks we're dead, so he won't be looking for us. Be very, very quiet. Let's go." And so they crept down the stairs and they slipped out the door and they started to run. And they ran and they ran and they ran, and they ran as hard and as fast as they could. And when they couldn't run anymore, Tom let them sit down and take a very short break, and then they had to get up and keep on running, because if they didn't, the ogre was going to catch them when he woke up in the morning. Well, when morning came, The ogre woke up and he said to his wife, "Wife, I killed those 7 little boys last night. Go upstairs to the bedroom and prepare them for my breakfast." And so she did. And when she got up to the top of the stairs, she let out a terrible scream because what she found was not 7 dead little boys, but 7 dead little daughters. And the ogre came running to see what was wrong, and he realized right away what had happened. And he went running back down the stairs, and he picked up his knife and his club, and he went over to the door, and he put on his special boots. You see, he had everyday boots that he wore when he went out marauding and hunting and such. But then, when he wanted to travel quickly, he had special magical boots. They were called 7-league boots, because with every step, you could travel 7 leagues, which is a very, very long distance. And so he put on his 7-league boots, and he picked up his club, and he ran out the door, looking for Tom and his brothers. And he ran all over the place looking, and you could hear him coming because the ground was shaking because he was running. And everywhere he went, people ran and hid in their houses. And they took their livestock, their cows and their chickens, and they locked them up and they hid them in their houses. And the ogre kept running all over looking for Tom and his brothers. But it's a well-known fact that anyone who wears 7-league boots gets very tired very quickly. And after a little while, the ogre got very tired. And so he sat down near a very big rock to take a rest. Now, it just so happened that Tom and his brothers were also taking a rest near that big rock. But Tom was clever. He had seen a little hole in the bottom underneath the rock, and he and his brothers had crawled in there to hide while they were resting. Well, the ogre sat down, and he leaned his back against the rock, and he sighed a few times, and he yawned a few times, and pretty soon, Tom was pretty sure the ogre was going to fall asleep. Well, Tom, he was so small that a lot of times people that were really big, like the ogre, didn't even notice him. So he decided he was going to see what he could see. And so he crept out of the hole as quiet as he could. And he hurried over to a nearby tree, and he climbed up the tree. And much to his delight, he saw smoke rising nearby and recognized his father's cottage. It wasn't very far away. And so he climbed back down the tree, and he crept back to his brothers, and he said, "All right, here's what we have to do. The ogre is almost asleep. As soon as he starts snoring, you all creep out very quietly. There's a hill right behind this rock. Go up the hill, down the other side, and across the meadow, and you'll find Father's house. You'll be safe there. Go there as soon as the ogre starts snoring. Don't worry about me. I'll take care of things, and I'll catch you up later." And so, as soon as the ogre started snoring, Tom and Tom's 6 brothers crept out from under the rock and over the hill and down the other side and across the meadow, and they ran home. And their mother and father were very happy to see them. Tom, on the other hand, he crept out and very carefully he pulled those 7-league boots off of the giant. Now, 7-league boots are magic, and they will shrink or they will grow to fit whoever tries to put them on. And so Tom, when he had pulled off the ogre's 7-league boots, he slipped them onto his own small feet, and in a quick as a flash, he went back to the ogre's house. And he knocked on the door. And when the ogre's wife came to the door, he said, "Madam, I have come to get some gold. You see, your husband has been captured, and I have come from him. See, here are his 7-league boots to prove that what I said was true. I have come from him. You need to give me the gold that he has hidden in the house so that I can take it back and get him out of prison." Well, the ogress's wife didn't think The ogre's wife did not stop to think about how her husband would have been captured. She just couldn't bear to lose her daughters and her husband in the same day. And so she hurried over to the loose floorboard in the house, and she pulled it up, and she pulled out 3 big bags of gold, and she gave them to Tom, and he took them, and he gathered them up in his arms, and he took them home with him, and he took them straight home to his father's house. And when he got there, he dropped them on the table, and he said, "Now all of our problems are solved. We can live very happily now." Now, some say that Tom didn't actually keep the gold, that he took it and he gave it to the king, for as his mother said, the gold was probably stolen from the king and his subjects. And some say that he took some of the gold back and he gave it to the ogre's wife, and he told her to keep it for when she got old and the ogre was gone. Whatever the truth of the story is, Tom's family really didn't need the gold. For you see, word got round very quickly of the young lad who had the 7-league boots, and the king contacted him, and the king hired him to be his messenger, for in his 7-league boots, Tom could travel very quickly from one end of the kingdom to the other. And so he became the king's messenger, and he was such a cheerful boy and such a clever one that the king grew rather fond of him, and after a while invited him to come and live in the palace. But Tom never forgot his family or where he came from, and every week he would go home to his family to make sure that they had everything that they needed and that they would not need to go hungry ever again. And that is the story of Tom Thumb. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you again on Wednesday at 3 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Here on the Milledgeville Public Library of Illinois Facebook page, we'll have another story for you from somewhere around the world. Have a great day. Bye.